Okay, welcome to our first session on succession, basically how biological communities change and adapt over time. Alright, so one characteristic of an ecosystem is its vegetation structure. Very often we're talking about structure, we're talking about vertical layering, what kind of vegetation is there, but all those things are basically changing to stimuli in the environment, whether it be the populations of organisms that are there, or abiotic factors like nutrients and soil and water, those types of things. They're changing to them over time. That concept is known as ecological succession. The more current terminology that's often used is community development, so be aware that those two terms are interchangeable. But it's basically just a response to the competition for those limited factors that are in the environment. Right, there's two main types of succession that we're going to talk about. The first being primary succession, and then the second being secondary succession. The difference is really what it starts from. In primary succession, you're basically developing a living community, or biotic, that term we're going to need to know, from essentially one that is non-biotic or infertile soil. It's all about the soul, which we'll talk a bit more about my goofy misspelling of that in this, but the soil is the basis for all the vegetation life, which then is the basis for all the consumers, and so on and so forth. Alright, so soil. Soil is not a dirty word or a four-letter word, not that it is, but anyways, it does have a very specific definition. It's comprised of weathered rock particles, organic matter, air, water, and then living organisms. Some would also include, this would be mineral matter, these rock particles. The old saying, you're walking on air if you're happy-go-lucky. Well, you are. We'll have a whole chapter on soils, but basically 50% of this space that you see in here is actually airspace or void. It's not all solid there. If it doesn't have all these things, then it's not really considered fertile, functioning soil. And it can take hundreds of years to thousands of years for this to actually be created. We're looking at just a little profile of soil here. You've got your grass up top there, more of your brown tones there, and when you get down here, this is more of what is known as the subsoil. Nothing you're being tested on now, but later on in the soils chapter. So where does this all begin? Well, it typically starts on bare rock or some other type of infertile soil that is missing some of those components that we had prior. And we have what are known as pioneer species. They're the first ones to make this journey. Very often, a classic example would be lichens, and that's what we're looking at here, lichens and mosses. Lichen is actually a symbiotic relationship between an algae and basically a fungus that will grow and be able to root itself kind of in the rock, at first very lightly, but they are literally using acids to dissolve away at the rock. And then the algae are what give it the color that allow it to photosynthesize and get its nutrients. Mosses are another common one that you'll see. Now, these are pretty rough conditions. They're going from hot to cold climates. Like a rock will go from boiling hot in the day when it's sitting in the sunshine to at nighttime it loses all its thermal energy and it goes very cold. More extreme environments, think about like a rock surface. It goes from being bone dry, you can't get water from a rock, which means it also is difficult to get your nutrients then as well too, to then being flooded, almost instantly, because water is not going to seep through the rock, it's just going to sit on top. So it's a very extreme lifestyle. It's one that we certainly couldn't survive. If you can imagine being strapped to an asphalt driveway in the middle of the summer, you'd very quickly dehydrate and die from it. So in order to survive these wide ranges of habitats or habitat conditions, they're going to generally be generalists. We're going to see a trend with succession when we get a little bit later on talking about early, mid, and late successional stages as you go through that development. More of the early ones are going to be generalists. The later ones are going to be specialists. A little bit more about primary succession here. Here's my typo that I was talking about earlier. It's meant to be soil, not soul, but If you're with a good soil scientist from the south, he'll go on and tell you about how important the soil is. Well, and everything starts from the soil. I'm like, okay, well, when we start talking about science, but it's just dialect. It's soil. We need organic matter to build up in it, and that basically is done through basically a process of fragmentation first. Fragmentation is we take a larger rock and we break it into pieces. One of the common ways is through freezing and thawing. As water gets into cracks and then it freezes, it will expand by 10% of its volume. That will push open that crack farther as it wedges in, and then eventually your rock breaks apart. This is one of the things I would expect you to know. This process of freezing and thawing and fragmentation, this mechanical process is called frost wedging. Your organic matter builds up by having generation after generation after generation of those pioneer species, and then eventually your early successional species growing up and dying, growing up and dying, growing up and dying. They add that layer of organic matter there. I do want to make a point about this bullet here and one correction as well. The first thing that's going to show up is actually annual grasses, not perennial. What is the difference between annual and perennial? Well, an annual goes through its entire life cycle in 1 year. From seed, immaturity, sexual maturity, reproduction, seed dispersal, death. All in 1 year, and then it doesn't come back. Perennial is one of those plants that takes longer to mature, but will reflower year after year after year. Like a tree would be an example of a perennial. So your earliest successional species, past the pioneer ones, after your lichens and mosses, starts to become some weeds, first annuals, annual grasses, annual herbs, things that go through their entire life cycle in 1 year. It's all about getting it while the getting is good, all right? Because in early successional stages, things change very quickly. You could, with only a couple inches of soil, you could go from having nutrients to no nutrients the next day. You could go from having water and then that little bit of soil drying out in the sun very quickly and everything desiccating and drying. So it's a live for the moment kind of evolutionary strategy. And annuals, which do it all in 1 year, are even faster at it. Very often they're called nature sprinters because they literally are all about getting to the ending line as quickly as they can. They send down roots, they break up the ground even more. As they die and decompose year after year after year, they continuously add more organic matter to the soil, and it's all about that short-time life. You know, make the gamble now. Spread your seeds and hope for the best. All right, then in mid-succession with primary succession, we're starting to add a little bit of soil now. It's not so much about what's beginning to get to be where it's about having enough moisture and nutrients in the soil, because it's just starting to really develop now. And this could be 100 years up to this point. We will actually start to get some shrubs and then later trees in the mid-successional stages, but they can't tolerate shade. They need that full sun to grow fast while the getting is good. It's still kind of right in that middle stage now where everything's still, even your trees are worried about trying to grow fast. One example, green ash, there's actually no E on the end of that. Green ash is an example. A lot of your other full sun trees or pine trees. Think pine trees or fast-growing deciduous trees. All right, late succession, and then we'll move on to our next section here. The last stage, now it's the whole tortoise and the hare kind of story. Now it's all about the tortoise. You're in it for the long haul. You're not worried about so much trying to expend all your energy real quick and get to reproduction. Instead, I'm going to take my time. And the reason why is because you have a lot of shade now. These things are starting to grow up underneath the other trees. They don't have all that sunlight to create tons of photosynthesis to really have a growth spurt. Instead, they're more about survival, storing some extra starches and lipids and other things so they can make it through the winter. And that slow growth and that shade-tolerant trees, eventually, without any other disturbances, will take over the other trees, outshade them, and then they'll be what is known as the climax community. Now, lots of things can happen. You can have a disturbance, a fire, a flood, or other things, that will set us back to the starting point again. But generally speaking, if this ecosystem stays stable, it'll be our climax community, and that late successional, shade-tolerant plants will be the ones that are left in the end. Succession always takes place faster in areas with more water and more temperature. It increases chemical reactions and increases the weathering of the soil, which creates it faster, which allows you to get through your successional stages quicker. All right, next time we'll pick up with secondary succession.